Ooh.
Yowza.
We're going to give it just a couple more minutes. I think there was about 30 lunches up here today, and we had about 27 minutes to get by one or two of them. So we'll give it a couple more minutes, and we'll get started. Okay, we will go ahead and call the meeting to order. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us today. This is the start of the 19 budget hearings for the Transportation Subcommittee in the House. Director Tomlinson, I think, wanted to start things off. He has somewhere to be, so we'll go ahead and get started.
Only have a couple of things to mention in our proposed fiscal year 2019 budget. If you turn to the second slide, the first slide is just background statistics that I presented to the committee when we did the amended budget. If you turn to the second slide, for the Georgia Regional Transportation Authority, there's actually no changes recommended in the governor's budget. It's the same amount that's been in our base budget over the past several years. So there are no changes or no requested funds as it relates to the Georgia Regional Transportation Authority. If you turn to the next page, you'll see payments to the State Road and Tollway Authority. Again, as a reminder, as an authority, if any dollars are coming over to the State Road and Tollway Authority, they come through in the payments to CERTA line in GDOT's budget. And what you have is just a series of reductions. There's two, both are related to the fact that Garvey debt is being reduced, and therefore the annual debt service payments are lower. So you would see a $4.6 million reduction and a $3.691 million deduction. And again, the debt service that we'll be paying in fiscal year 19 is lower. The other changes are they look like two reductions. One is $7.9 million. That's a reduction in general funds, and $4.4 million reduction. But again, what was really happening there is a fund swap. You would see $12.3 million in increased motor fuel funds. So it's just the source of funding is being switched in GDOT's budget. That in turn just results in a reduction from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 19 in the payments to CERTA of approximately, excuse me, of approximately $7 million. So really, it's just some administrative changes, lower debt service, and a fund source swap. There's nothing substantive being changed in our budget in any area.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tomlinson. Are there any questions from the committee? You must have done a good job, because I don't see any.
All right.
Or maybe we just don't quite understand it yet.
Well,
Maybe we'll ask GDOT where.
you'll hear about where
Where
what
it's
they're
going.
doing with the reduced
Right.
amounts that are being retained in their budget
Right.
presentation.
Hey, Pam. All right. Well, you don't have any questions, so thank you. And I know you had somewhere to be, so that worked out good for
All
you
right.
too. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Next, we'll go call up Commissioner McMurray with GDOT and Angela. And I know I'd like to acknowledge the former Commissioner Vance Smith in the room, and former House Transportation Chairman, and a good friend to us all. Good to see you. Commissioner, glad you're feeling a little better. I know you're like most people around here that's had a little bit of issues from whatever it is that's going around. So it's good to have you and Angela here, and we'll just let you get started.
All right, well, thank you. It's good to be back in the saddle and feeling a little better. I may sound a little deep voiced today, but that won't let us slow us down. So let's jump into fiscal year 19, and this is a little bit of a repeat of what you saw in amended 18, but I always like to again highlight the great work of the Transportation Funding Act of 2015. Again, without that, we would have a much really a sad story to talk about as it comes to state transportation funding in 19 if it wasn't for that. And you can see on the second slide there that last year's 18 budget was about $1.99 billion versus it would have been about $883 million. Needless to say, we would have had a hard time even doing the most basic of projects in maintenance if that had not been realized. On the next slide, on slide 3, again, a repeat of what you've seen before, but I bring you an update from the federal funding front. Here we are in the 5th month of the federal fiscal year, and we're on the 5th continuing resolution of funding, which has become very problematic. In fact, some of these periods of funding have been only for a couple of weeks at a time, so that makes it very difficult to deliver projects. I was just talking with Meg Perkle, our chief engineer. We are now getting projects ready for April bidding if there was federal funding. So what happened last week on February 8th, and since I've been with you the last time, was a continuing resolution to March 23rd. As you know and saw tracked on the national news, they worked on spending caps. Congress basically came to terms on spending caps, which will provide for basically a 2-year budget appropriation, but it will have to be appropriated by March 23rd. We're hopefully, based with those spending caps in place, that Congress will then enact a physical appropriations for the rest of this federal fiscal year, which would then give us the ability to advance projects without further limitation. Just as a reminder, we've advanced over $820 million of construction projects to bid this year, while we've only received really about $300 million or so of federal dollars. So we're right at $1 billion short of what we would anticipate out of the federal government for the entire federal fiscal year. Needless to say, let me tell you what kind of impact that's having. So far, we've got about $480 million of projects that are truly at risk or have been delayed. For our February letting, we were only able to do about $92 million of projects. And April is only about, right now they're stacking up in April and May, so those projects are sort of stacking up. As we delay projects, we're going to have to move those and cascade them into the summer, which creates a lot larger project bidding or letting, as we call them, situation, which isn't good for us or the industry, because you're sort of front loading or loading up a lot of work in a few months' time. So as I remind you, that the reason that's important is we have to marry up our state budget that we're here to talk about today with those federal fund codes that are shown on that slide, on slide 3. So you have to get alignment. That's where accountants love to get that alignment of dollars and cents. So just again, an update. And of course, on the federal front, also the update yesterday was really a positive day with the president rolling out the infrastructure plan. I feel like Georgia is very well positioned to try to capitalize on the tenets of that plan. Obviously, Congress has to enact, and that has to move through Congress as well before the president's plan's enacted and can be actionable. But I feel like Georgia is very well positioned to try to capitalize on all those important parts and to move Georgia's transportation infrastructure forward. So yesterday was a good day. The speaker being there for that announcement. It's very one of few. I think there was only 20 or so, 24, 25 people there, I think, in that room. So that was quite an honor for Speaker Ralston to be there. And I was able to join a conference call with the White House later in the day, who was held by D.J. Gribbin, the special advisor to the President of Infrastructure, who sort of went through that plan. And I will bring more details to you as more details come forward and as more things happen in Congress. The next slide is 4. Again, a repeat slide that this committee has seen before, but again, to highlight what's been done since we started our 18-month plan back in January 2016. Some 499 projects have been bid out. That's why you're seeing cones out across the state. And where the map on the right, again, is the next 18 months, which has added 196 more projects out to that original map. So you can see that when you look at this map, I always like to call it the shotgun map. It looks like, somebody shot the map of Georgia with a shotgun, because there's projects literally going on across the entire state of Georgia. Mr. Chairman, we'll move into slide 5, which is the actual FY19 budget recommendation. And this is really a graphic look at our budget as a whole, and we've grouped several of the budget categories into main categories, if you will, starting on the left side of the bar chart of capital projects, which consist of 52% of our entire budget, which goes into the capital construction projects, capital maintenance, and local roads administration. So you can see over half of our budget's actually in the project delivery of the major projects out the door. The next category we have grouped together is general operations, which consist of 11% of the overall budget. This general operation basically consists of several categories: construction administration, which deals with the actual pre-construction engineering delivery of projects, data collections, departmental admin, the planning office, and also traffic management. That again constitutes $213.8 million, or 11% of our budget. The next category highlighted of the FY19 budget is the LMIG, the Local Maintenance Improvement Grant Program, which is a fantastic program for our cities and counties, which again by formula distribution gets 10% of the total excise excise revenue for the fiscal year at $183 million. The next category, which is another large important category, is the routine maintenance. That is the preventative maintenance that our men and women and our contractors do to take care of our roadways and bridges. That's a 21% share at $409 million. Payments to CERTA, you just heard from Chris Tomlinson on, constitutes $103.3 million, which is 5%, and I'll give you a breakdown on that later. And finally, intermodal, which again is state general funds, is $18.4 million, or about 1% of the overall budget. So again, a good graphic way to look at the entire budget, which is $1.916 billion, which is an increase of $15.49 million over the base. So on the next slide, I'd like to highlight in a consolidated view, if you will, what this looks like. So if all these changes can be found on pages 88 and 89 of the tracking document, or on HB 684, I believe they start on page 102, and I'll try to give you the line number if you want to follow along that way as well. But this table, and I'll walk through this table, only deals with the ones that change. So if there's no change, I'll just skip over that category. So starting with capital construction, we see a total increase of $51 million. That's on page 88, or line 47.1 and 47.11. Excuse me. So the lion's share of the 51 million, 12.1 million comes from additional revenue, and then 38.8 million comes from a redistribution out of our routine maintenance category. That sounds bad, but it's not. We actually knew that once HB 170 was realized that it was going to take us additional routine maintenance dollars to get state of good repair back under control, but after we had a 2.5-year budget cycle now, we're able to reduce that level and put more money into the actual projects. So some of the bigger projects you've seen, like the concrete rehabilitation, where the concrete is being patched, like on I-75 and I-16 and those corridors, those are big capital expenses that came out of our routine maintenance budget. Now we're able to move those dollars back over the capital side for projects. The next line is on data collections, add of $1.1 million. And again, this is to really match the increased federal share there and some of the federal requirements to report on basically asset condition and asset inventory. So that is an add there. The next line we have is LMIG in an increase of $3.165 million, which is based on the increased revenue from excise, which is very positive. I'd like to highlight that one again because it is important to our cities and counties. And if you go back to prior to the TFA of 2015, this represents a 47, almost 50% increase in funding that's going to local governments, to cities and counties. So that's a very positive impact that's had. The next category is planning, a $500,000 increase to meet the needs of, again, federal funding that's available for planning studies. The next category on the chart is routine maintenance, which I've addressed, which is a reduction of $38.8 million. Next also is traffic management, is a $7 million add, and that's for the increased operation and maintenance needs of our express lanes that go to our hero operators. Again, as I mentioned in the amended FY18 budget, same thing for this over the $7 million over the base is for those continued operations of our heroes that operate in our express lane system. The next we have on the chart is payment to CERTA. Again, Director Thomason talked about that. Net change of about negative $8.2 million, almost 8.3. And again, really more of a fund source swap. The biggest changes he talked about came from reduced debt from our Garvey bonds that we paid back. Garvey bonds, as a reminder, are basically a federal bond that has an 80-20 share. So 80% of that comes out of our federal program to pay down the bond debt, and then 20% is the state match. So we actually had about $7 million, $6.8 million reduction just in the Garvey payment. That's a positive thing. That means those dollars are deployed back into doing projects. So that's the biggest change there, and then really the fund source swap between motor fuel and state general fund. Pardon me. The bottom part of the chart is dealing with state general fund dollars, which came from the Transportation Funding Act. Very small change in departmental admin, which was a redistribution basically of $3,200 dealing with moving from intermodal to cybersecurity insurance. So a very small change there. And the last one to highlight is dealing with the intermodal budget. This program includes a reduction of $150,000, which was put in the base for a one-time feasibility study on the strategy to mitigate man-made shipping channels to the shoreline that really affect Tybee Island. That was put in the base originally to do a study that the Corps of Engineers is participating in. This is the state share Since that was in the base, it's coming out of the base now, so it's no longer needed. That was the biggest change. Again, we had the add from departmental admin of $3,200 for cybersecurity, a very small deduct of $278 for a merit system reduction, a $353 premium insurance add, and a $53 TeamWorks billing increase, a net change of $146,000 to the good or reduction. Apologize. On the next slide, for FY19, highlights our bridge bond request. Again, a $100 million request that will advance 18 of Georgia's structurally deficient bridges. We currently have 79 of those. Thank you, Josh. We currently have 79 of our bridges on the state routes posted and still some about 1,600 local bridge posted. So this addresses bridges in Butts, Chattooga, Cherokee, Cobb, Coffee, Decatur, Fulton, Gordon, Houston, Jackson, Jeff Davis, Montgomery, Macon, Meriwether, Murray, and Ware counties. So 18 bridges, and several of those are multiple bridges in the same county. You can see from these pictures that we still have work to do in getting our bridges in safe and sound shape. Mr. Chairman, the last slide is again our conditioning slide of pardon our progress. FY19, with approval of this budget, will make Georgia continue to be orange, even though it should be red and black. So that concludes the formal presentation. I'll be glad to entertain any questions, comments.
Says a lot coming from the Georgia Southern guy. Commissioner, thank you for the presentation, and you have a few questions from the committee. We're going to start with Representative Estration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for your presentation. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about some specific issues in my district and Gwinnett County, and wanted to maybe speak generally about congestion relief. Traffic congestion is a very significant issue for my constituents, and know that you've been able to detail for me some of the efforts that are being undertaken to address that. But I was just curious if you could maybe detail as to capital construction projects or consideration that's given to traffic congestion. I'll certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were recently ranked again in the top 10 of a ranking we don't want to be in Georgia. Number 4 in the nation for cities, Metro Atlanta, with being the most congested. Number 8 in the world. So that's not where we want to be. We've worked very strategically since the Transportation Funding Act of 2015 passed, first and foremost to take care of state of good repair. And I think you can see that as reflected in this budget. But on top of that, how do we deal with mobility and mobility issues? So very excited that when we rolled out that initial 10-year plan that we had 11 projects that really moved the needle on mobility and try to take on congestion in a meaningful way. First time I think in a long time that anything of this magnitude has been put forward. And those are the 11 projects that total about $11 billion that work on freight mobility and people mobility. One of our earliest wins, of which we've already gone to bid on, was doing freight congestion relief up the Interstate 85 corridor in from Gwinnett into Jackson County, and so actually got into Barrow County as well. So trying to take on those things like freight congestion and mobility on our interstates, as well as building express lanes here in metropolitan Atlanta. We're expanding upon what we've already been doing with express lanes on 75 here on the south of town, the Interstate 85 corridor that exists now. But this summer, as we open up the express lanes in Cobb and Cherokee County, some 30 miles with our partners from CERTA, that will open these up this summer, will be a game changer. But what those 11 projects do is start connecting express lanes on 75 to express lanes that will be built on 400 to the express lanes on 85, which are actually being expanded now, as you know, to 285, to express lanes around 285. So Atlanta begins a connected system. Those are the first major pieces of the puzzle. That's not all the pieces to the puzzle. That's the total solution. The transit discussion is a very big part of that, as you know, is going on even today. All these things have to come together for Georgia to continue to move forward in mobility. And we have to continue to look for innovative solutions. Most all these projects have some form of finance. That's why I said earlier that I think Georgia competes very well with the president's proposal that's been put out, because a lot of those were public-private minded. So we're able to try to advance these major projects in that manner, and hopefully we can capitalize on some discretionary federal money that lessens our finance piece. And with that, we can go do the next project and the next project. So it's quite a challenge, but we're working and making great strides in that arena. I think, according to my peers and industry, people are watching Georgia because we're making some pretty bold moves and trying to move the needle in a positive kind of way. The other thing that just came out just within the last few weeks was the freight bottlenecks. Regretfully, out of the top 100, I think Georgia had 7 or 8. We had the number 1, of which you can't even get to your district without going through. That's being Spaghetti Junction. I'm proud to say that out of the top 10, the 4 of them that we have projects already in development on, including Spaghetti Junction. Not a total correction of the congestion that exists there, but certainly an improvement with the express lanes, collector distributor lanes that will be built as part of the top end 285 project. So we're trying to make marked improvement there. But you have to pull a lot of arrows out of the quiver to take on congestion and mobility. Capacity, express lanes, bottlenecks, all those projects are very important, as well as transit and proper development as well.
Mr. Redfield.
Sure.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I was curious with the announcements out of Washington and the proposals that are in place, and maybe some of the specifics aren't yet formalized, but I know in the past there's been an issue as projects with federal funding were approved that it might take many years for the projects to actually be completed. With this cooperation or coordination that we're talking about here, do you anticipate that timeline might be in some ways sped up, that good working relationship between local, state, and federal government in this proposal would allow those projects to be completed a little bit quicker?
Absolutely. I mean, that's been one of the tenets that the administration has talked about. I think that was articulated again yesterday. So we're very eager to see that. We're poised and ready to do anything we can to streamline and take advantage of any efficiency that exists in the permitting and regulatory side. And again, providing a good, solid transportation project that doesn't harm the environment, that actually has benefits. So we're very excited about those opportunities and want to capture any opportunity that exists.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Colonel, do you have a question? Pam? What number are you, Pam? 25? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner. I wanted to ask a question about the $38 million that was taken out of, what's that,
Routine maintenance.
I thought that the bill that we passed, that everything was staying routine maintenance. I just was wondering about that.
Yeah, so when we initially started our 10-year plan, we knew that we had a backlog of deferred maintenance, but we knew as we started working that off, we could get to a more sustainable funding level. And then as we're developing other projects, which some of those are capital maintenance projects, this comes out of the routine maintenance, which is really the roadways, roadsides work that our men and women at GDOT do, and then we contract for as well. So we're sort of getting the state of good repair and conditions in better shape, and then moving those dollars over into capital construction dollars, which does projects such as which is total rehabilitation or rebuild projects. So that's always been sort of the plan as we move forward. So don't worry that something is going to be neglected on the maintenance side of the house. That's still our foundational, most important thing we do is take care of our existing assets.
Thank you, Representative Dickerson.
Sorry.
Did you have a question? 17. Representative Laricchia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we heard the word rural all summer and through the interim, but is there anything specific or anything strategic as far as addressing some of the transportation issues in rural Georgia? You know, we're right in the middle, or no, we're probably wrapping up the recommendations for the project list for T-Splost. And one of the things that kept coming up was, well, what's the Georgia Department of Transportation planning? What does their plan look like moving forward? And in as much as I know that congestion is a very real problem up here, it's not to the people where I live,
Right.
And I certainly want to help them fix that problem. But what can you tell us maybe a little bit more about what GDOT's doing with our board to, address some of the concerns about widening and resurfacing and all that?
Yeah, absolutely, and great question, because it's one that 14 board members certainly hear about and want to address, because we cover every corner of the state. And one is obviously congressional balancing, make sure that there's an equitable spend of transportation investment across the entire state by the 14 congressional districts. So that's really a good safeguard there, but doing a lot of things. As our planning director has put in place, and part of the 10-year plan is we're advancing some things like 140 projects that, or phases of projects that work on freight movement across rural Georgia, which are 2-lane to 4-lane are the key freight corridors, of which, again, we have identified through our planning studies of what are those freight arterials or those freight corridors that need to be improved to really help north, south, and east-west freight movement through rural Georgia, not the interstates. We're not talking about interstates, but through rural Georgia. And of course, continue to working on bridges throughout the state. Bridges to me are just critical in the investment that we continue to make now, which is about three and a half times prior to the Transportation Funding Act, to reduce those bridges, just like the bond projects, those ones that are posted. And if you've heard those counties, most of those counties were rural. So that agricultural, agribusiness can cross those bridges without impediment, which obviously if you got to drive around or can't go across, that's a bottom line impact to the farmer or the agribusinessman. So doing a lot of those things, projects throughout. So when we looked at the 10-year plan, and I'm shooting from the hip, we looked at how much of the investments in urban versus rural. And when you look at all the urban areas of the state versus rural, it bounced back and forth around 50-50, 48-52, 49-51. So when we looked at it over the 10 years, it's pretty well balanced in the first few years. Now, I will tell you that in a few years out, when we do some of these bigger public-private partnerships, some of those dollars are really big in the upfront years for those projects. So it sort of skews the scale. Not to say that projects are not getting done. It's just the way they appear because they are a financed project. But those are the things we look at, is where where those dollars being spent. And again, for the next few years, it really bounces around. It's not exactly 50-50, but it's like 48-52. It's not a big disparity there. So. We certainly understand the needs across this entire state.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. I'll just wrap it up by saying thank you again for the presentation and for all the hard work you guys are doing. I'll just have to admit that it's very frustrating, I know, to see what y'all are dealing with on the shortfall with the continuing resolutions on the federal side. So I'll just ask, after the meeting yesterday and with the rollout of the plan, have they addressed at all how they're going to fund it, and how that's going to play into all this lack of permanent funding that we've been seeing?
So what I see is two different discussions. One being the president's infrastructure bill, and then actual funding of the basic highway trust fund, where our basic regular program comes through, which is being delayed by these continuing resolutions, is a separate discussion. So I see them as two discussions, but at some point I think they'll have to, obviously have to address both of them, reconcile them somehow. So that will be an interesting discussion, I'm sure.
Well, maybe they'll figure it out. Any other questions? All right, Commissioner, thank you. We'll be reviewing this. I'll just point out that what I see in terms of driving around, the state routes look great. There's obviously continuing maintenance, and y'all have done a great job the last 2.5 years. It's obvious that a lot of good work's been done. but I still see, when you're riding on the county-maintained roads in rural Georgia, some of the worst roads that you can imagine. So I think eventually, I hope we can continue to address that. I know we've increased LMIG, but, just, I'd love to keep that in mind as we move forward on the 19 budget, if there's anything we could do there.
Okay.
All right, thank you. We're dismissed.
Thank you,
Thank y'all
sir.
for being here.
Thank you.
I think there's a second district GDOT board meeting going on in a few minutes, so we got plenty of time to get over there for those that need to cast a vote.